My family said I failed. Then my brother's fiancée looked at me and said, "You're the founder." The entire table went silent, except for the soft clink of a wine glass being slowly lowered. My brother's fiancée turned to me, her eyes narrowing, trying to match the name in her head with the face across from her. Then she said it, quietly, with that sharp flicker of recognition that felt like an electric wire snapped loose. "Wait, you're the founder. You're Sienna Miller of Inner Bridge." Her voice carried just enough across the table for my father to freeze in mid-sip and my mother to drop her napkin. My brother looked between us, confused, still half believing I worked some front desk job in a therapy clinic. I said nothing at first, just nodded, calmly. And in that moment, every family dinner, every time they told me I was wasting my potential, every holiday where they praised my brother's achievements and glanced over mine, it all folded into one long breath that I finally let go of. But to understand why that moment mattered, why it landed like a quiet thunderclap across a crystal-lit engagement dinner in Seattle's most exclusive rooftop venue, you have to know the years that came before it. I'm Sienna Miller. I'm 34. I live in Portland, Oregon, and I co-founded a mental health startup called Inner Bridge that's quietly become one of the fastest growing therapy access platforms in North America. But none of that mattered to my family, not when I was 15 and said I wanted to study psychology, not when I graduated early from Stanford with a degree in cognitive science, and definitely not when I left my full-ride PhD program to build something that didn't exist yet. In their eyes, I wasn't a doctor. I wasn't a soldier. I wasn't following the right path. I was disappointing. My father, Colonel David Miller, is a retired military commander with 3 tours and a row of medals he keeps framed in our family living room. My mother, Joanne, runs the home like a base organized, spotless, and rooted in routine and image. And then there's Aaron, my older brother, a military doctor, decorated, the golden son who made my parents beam even when he just talked about cholesterol levels. Our home in Tacoma wasn't unloving, but it was measured. Praise came with strings. Affection was earned through conformity, not expression. I was the child who cried at war documentaries and journaled through every emotion I couldn't say out loud. They didn't understand that, and they didn't try to. By high school, it was clear I wouldn't be the legacy they hoped for. I didn't sign up for ROTC. I didn't want to pursue law or medicine. I wanted to understand people, why they hurt, why they isolated, why they broke in silence. I volunteered at crisis hotlines before I had a driver's license and read neuroscience journals under my covers at night. When I got into Stanford, my father called it a pleasant surprise, as if achievement only counted when it mirrored Aaron's. When I told them I'd chosen cognitive science over pre-med, my mother pursed her lips and asked if I was sure I wasn't wasting the opportunity. I told myself I didn't care, that I'd show them later, that maybe if I made something real, they'd see. But grad school wasn't enough. The theories were brilliant, but the systems were broken. I kept hearing the same stories from students, teachers, even therapists themselves, long wait lists, unaffordable care, shallow apps that offered buzzwords instead of healing. That's when I met Harper. She was doing a joint program in design and clinical psychology. She had the code, I had the framework, together. We started sketching something different tech that didn't just triage but truly connected people with care. Not bots, not empty dashboards, but actual licensed professionals, matched through deeper behavioral data and empathy mapping. We called it Inner Bridge. The early days were blurry. nights in cafes, weekends buried in whiteboards, fighting server crashes, writing code on secondhand laptops, and pitching to people who didn't understand why mental health was worth investing in. Harper and I lived on microwave meals and split rent on a one-bedroom apartment with furniture from Craigslist. Meanwhile, back home, my parents believed I was figuring things out. They asked if I wanted to interview at Aaron's hospital for an admin role. They sent job listings for HR assistant positions. They never once asked what I was building. I let it be. I stopped explaining. I told them I was consulting. I didn't want to beg them to believe in something they didn't even want to understand. But I kept building. We got into an accelerator, got seed funding, grew our platform. We signed our first healthcare client in year 2, and slowly, the thing that wasn't real to them began changing lives for people they would never know. And then came the email. Horizon Ventures, one of the biggest investment firms in digital health, wanted to discuss a Series B round. The lead partner was someone named Juliet Carter. I didn't know yet that name would return to me weeks later in a completely different setting. Not in a pitch meeting, not in a Zoom room, but at my brother's engagement dinner. Juliet Carter, at the time, her name was just one line in an email from Horizon Ventures' West Coast portfolio team. She had requested a preliminary call to understand our growth metrics, market position, and future roadmap. I remember Googling her before the meeting and noting the crisp, polished photo that came up on every business site. MBA from Wharton, background in neuroscience, a clean track record of late-stage investments in health tech that all led to impressive exits. I admired her precision. I respected how prepared she was during our call, how she already knew our quarterly user growth and referenced our most recent case study from a California school district using InterBridge to offer free therapy to underserved teens. She asked tough questions, but they were smart ones. She didn't question the mission, just the model. I didn't know then that 2 weeks later, she would be sitting across from me at a white tablecloth dinner with my family, wearing the same signature blazer, only this time with a diamond ring my brother had given her. The irony didn't strike me immediately. After the first meeting, she passed the conversation on to her associates, and Harper took over the due diligence process. I stayed focused on product. That was always our split. I designed the logic. She handled the business. It worked. We built trust like engineers build bridges quietly, with every stress point considered. The deal moved forward quickly, almost too cleanly. And we knew Horizon wasn't just investing. They were preparing for a full acquisition proposal. We didn't have a number yet, but the whispers around the VC table suggested it would cross the $100 million line, especially with 2 hospital systems now in pilot. All of that was unfolding when the call from my mother came. She never used to call unless something serious happened. This time, she sounded excited, like a debutante preparing for a gala. Aaron and Juliet are having their engagement dinner in Seattle next month, she said. They've booked the Westview Garden Room at Aloria. You'll be there. Of course, it wasn't a question. Aloria was a restaurant I'd seen in design magazines, perched above Puget Sound, with panoramic glass walls and a dress code stricter than most embassies. I'd never been there. Of course Aaron had. Of course, I said, keeping my voice even. Just send me the details. 3 days later, I got an email with the seating chart, travel itinerary, and wardrobe suggestions. It read more like a corporate onboarding document than a family dinner. I laughed quietly to myself when I saw the note from my mother at the bottom. Make sure you wear something structured and elegant. No drapey sweaters this time, structured and elegant. It was always about image. I knew what they expected from me in appearance, not a presence. They still thought I was floating between jobs, maybe helping with admin work for clinics, maybe doing something vague in tech that didn't quite amount to anything real. I had stopped correcting them years ago, the last time I tried. My father told me with full sincerity that maybe I'd feel more grounded if I worked in a hospital setting where routines were clear. I told him I'd built something real. He said, "Even real things collapse when you don't have a foundation." That was the moment I decided not to share anything further. If he didn't think I had a foundation, he didn't deserve to know what I was building on top of it. Harper supported that decision. "You don't owe anyone a PowerPoint on your life," she once said after I debated telling my parents about our Series A milestone. "They'll either see it or they won't. Either way, keep building." So I did. I poured everything into Interbridge, every feature, every user feedback loop, every partner integration. We redesigned the onboarding flow to reduce dropout rates. We rebuilt the back end to allow for scalable therapist matching. We listened, tweaked, stayed up late, rewriting code, and calming anxious clients. We weren't just solving a technical problem. We were solving the human weight of not being heard. And as it turns out, people were desperate to be heard. Our active user base tripled within 8 months. Schools, universities, remote workforces, even correctional facilities started reaching out. Our small Portland-based team of 10 became 30. And Harper negotiated our first international licensing deal. Still, my family knew none of it. When I arrived at the engagement dinner, I wore a simple navy jumpsuit with a silk belt and clean heels. No jewelry, no designer label visible, just neutral, timeless, quiet. I didn't need to dress for approval anymore. My brother greeted me with a quick hug and pointed me to my seat, across from a woman whose face looked vaguely familiar, but I couldn't place it yet. Her posture was confident, her smile reserved. Juliet. It hit me a few minutes later, halfway through the toasts, just before the entree. Horizon Ventures, the blazer, the voice, the emails, and then a slow turning moment as her eyes met mine with a flicker of recognition. She didn't say anything yet. Not then, but I knew what was coming, and I didn't flinch. Juliet didn't say anything until dessert, up to that point. The engagement dinner had followed a predictable script, toasts that ran a little long, polished jokes from Aaron's residency friends, a slideshow of vacation photos I hadn't been invited on. My father spoke about legacy and duty. My mother added her usual commentary about choosing a partner who fits the family's values. I sat between a cousin who barely remembered my name and an uncle who once told me therapy was a scam for people without discipline. I smiled when appropriate, responded when spoken to, and quietly studied Juliet. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She didn't overperform or seek approval. She listened more than she talked, asked specific questions, and never once tried to over-explain what she did. That alone set her apart from most of the people in the room. When someone mentioned that Horizon Ventures had invested in a promising new AI tool for hospital scheduling, her expression barely changed. She gave a simple nod and let the conversation move on. But when she turned to me, her focus sharpened. "I'm sorry. I didn't catch what you do," she said casually, but her eyes were already searching. I gave her the line I'd used with every family member for years. "I work in behavioral health tech, mostly operations." Her gaze held mine a little longer than polite curiosity would allow. "Interesting. I've seen a few companies in that space. What's the name of the platform you're with?" I held her stare just long enough to feel the temperature shift. "Interbridge." There was a pause. barely noticeable to others. But I felt it. Her breath caught. Her eyes widened, just slightly. Then she blinked and reset her tone. "That's yours," she asked softly. "You're Sienna Miller." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't announce it to the room. But the table fell quiet anyway. My brother turned toward her, confused. "You mean she works there?" he asked. Juliet didn't answer him right away. Her attention was still on me. "You're the founder," she repeated. Not as a challenge, but in disbelief. I nodded once. "Co-founder and CEO," I said, my voice steady. There it was, the rupture, the moment every version of their assumptions cracked. My mother froze mid-bite. My father's expression went blank, the same way he used to look at soldiers in training who broke protocol. Aaron blinked, then laughed awkwardly, like he thought this might be some misunderstanding. "Wait, you're serious," he said, trying to recover. "You're not just working there, you built it. I didn't need to respond. Juliet did it for me." "Horizon has been in due diligence with her company for weeks," she said. "Now speaking to the room as much as to me, we're in final negotiations. The platform has over 1 million users and some of the most impressive retention metrics we've ever seen. It's remarkable." The word hung in the air like an unfamiliar scent. No one knew how to respond. My cousin blinked at me like I'd grown a second head. My uncle cleared his throat and looked at his plate. My mother, to her credit, recovered first. "Well," she said, her voice a shade too bright, "isn't that something we always knew Sienna was good with computers?" Juliet looked at her sharply, not unkindly, but clearly unconvinced. I offered nothing, no smug smile, no apology for not telling them, just a calm breath and a sip of water. I didn't need to perform, not anymore. The rest of the evening was a blur of rewired small talk. Everyone had questions now. What was Interbridge's valuation? How many employees had we raised venture capital? Did we plan to expand internationally? It felt surreal, watching people who had never asked about my work suddenly scramble to understand the edges of it. I answered politely, without embellishment. The validation didn't land the way I'd once imagined. There was no swelling music, no cinematic slow motion, just a slow, sinking realization that all those years of invisibility weren't due to my failures, but their refusal to see. Aaron didn't say much after that. I think he was processing the fact that his younger sister, the one he thought he might one day have to help out, was negotiating with the woman he planned to marry and holding her own. My father barely looked at me the rest of the night. My mother tried to touch my arm once, said we should have brunch, catch up properly. I nodded, but didn't commit. I wasn't angry, just tired. Tired of years trying to earn something they'd never intended to give. That night, when I got back to my hotel, I stood by the window and looked out over Seattle's skyline. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't explaining myself to anyone, and that silence felt better than applause. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was anxious or overwhelmed, but because I kept replaying the stillness in the room after Juliet said my name. I had imagined moments like that in abstract terms for years, but when it finally happened, it didn't feel victorious. It felt quiet, final, like a door I had once begged to open had creaked wide on its own, only to reveal how little I needed what was behind it. The next morning, I took a walk through Pike Place before sunrise, letting the cold, salt air settle my thoughts. My phone buzzed with a message from Harper asking how the dinner had gone. I just replied with 3 words. They found out. Then I turned off my notifications and bought a coffee from a vendor who didn't care who I was. It was the most peaceful 30 minutes I'd had all weekend. When I got back to the hotel, there was already an email from my mother. The subject line read, "Let's talk." I didn't open it. I didn't need to. I knew the pattern too well. First came the sudden interest, then the reframing, a few kind words, a reference to how we always knew you were capable, followed by suggestions, expectations, and the quiet hope that I'd let them in now that I was deemed worthy. But I had learned the difference between curiosity and control, between pride and possession. Just because someone is your parent doesn't mean they're entitled to your inner world. Later that afternoon, I met Juliet for coffee. She had requested it after the dinner, gently and privately, with none of the pressure I might have expected from someone in her position. She didn't want to talk business, she said. Just a conversation. Woman to woman. I agreed, mostly out of respect. When we sat down, she looked at me for a moment before speaking. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I didn't know Aaron's sister was the founder we'd been negotiating with. If I had, I would have told you directly. I hope that oversight didn't make anything harder." I appreciated her candor. I told her the truth, that her surprise hadn't bothered me, that the reaction from my family had been louder than anything she said. She nodded slowly, then smiled. "You're not what I expected. That's a compliment. By the way," we talked for almost an hour. She told me about her own path, about growing up as the only girl in a family of hedge fund managers, about having to prove she understood both numbers and people in an industry that rarely respected both. She said something that stuck with me. When you're not who they thought you'd be, even your success becomes a threat to the story they built about you. I didn't respond right away, but it hit something true. My success wasn't just new information to my family. It was a disruption. It meant they had to admit they'd been wrong, that their metrics weren't universal, that value could grow in soil they dismissed as barren. The next week, I flew back to Portland and walked straight into a product review meeting with our development team. No press, no headlines, no family drama, just lines of code, user retention metrics, and the rhythm of builders doing what we love. That was my real world. It had been all along. Harper didn't ask how the trip went until the meeting ended. I told her everything over takeout. She didn't gasp or cheer. She just listened and handed me a dumpling. "Well," she said after a while, "you handled it better than I would have. I probably would have brought a branded Interbridge tote to the dinner just to stir the pot." I laughed, and for the first time in days, it felt easy. What I didn't expect was how quickly the ripple would travel. Within a week, I received messages from cousins I hadn't heard from in years. Some congratulated me. Some asked vague questions about investments and startups. One even asked if I was hiring. I responded with brief but polite answers. The sudden warmth from people who had once smirked when I mentioned mental health work didn't feel like progress. It felt like proximity to value. And that's not the same as belief. My father sent a text the following Friday. Just 3 words. "Proud of you." No punctuation. No context. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't respond. That weekend, I had brunch with Emily, my oldest friend from high school. She was one of the few who had seen the early versions of Interbridge when it was still sticky notes and sleep deprivation. I told her everything, and she listened the way real friends do, without an agenda. "You know what's wild," she said. "They finally saw you, and you didn't even need them to anymore. That sentence stayed with me long after she left. I didn't build Innerbridge for recognition. I built it for the 15-year-old version of myself who wished someone had listened without judgment. And that mission didn't change just because someone finally looked up. About a week after returning to Portland, I finally opened the email from my mother. It wasn't long. She simply said she wanted to have a real conversation, that there were things she didn't understand, and perhaps she hadn't asked the right questions. The tone was softer than I expected, but I'd been down this road before. I didn't respond right away. I forwarded it to Dr. Lang, my therapist, and brought it up in our next session. She leaned back in her chair after reading it and asked me something I hadn't prepared for. Do you want her to understand? Or do you want her to admit she was wrong? The question landed somewhere deep. I'd spent years telling myself I didn't care if they saw me. But something about that dinner, about the quiet shock on my father's face, about the sudden shift in my brother's posture, told me I wasn't entirely detached. I wanted to be seen, but I also wanted to be seen without conditions. Eventually, I agreed to meet my parents for dinner, a neutral restaurant, no fanfare, no family invites, just us. They arrived on time, dressed as if it were an event that required rehearsed dignity. My mother wore pearls. My father wore a blazer I hadn't seen since Aaron's med school graduation. The conversation started with pleasantries, but the tension hummed beneath every sentence. After we ordered, my father broke the surface. "You've built something impressive," he said, carefully. "I read an article about Innerbridge last night. Seems like it's helping a lot of people." I nodded, unsure where to place the compliment. My mother chimed in next. "Why didn't you tell us? All these years we thought you were struggling." Her voice trembled slightly, and I saw a flicker of something I hadn't expected. Not guilt, not shame, but displacement, like she didn't know where to file this version of me in her catalog of expectations. I answered honestly, because every time I tried to tell you something that didn't fit what you wanted for me, you made it clear it didn't count, so eventually, I stopped sharing. My father leaned forward, lacing his fingers like he was preparing for a debate. "We only wanted the best for you. Sienna, we didn't understand this world you were entering. It didn't seem stable. It didn't seem real." I held his gaze. Just because something doesn't look familiar doesn't mean it isn't real. I didn't need you to understand every line of code. I just needed you to ask what it meant to me. There was a pause after that, the kind that stretches longer than it should. Then my mother looked down at her napkin and said quietly, "I think we were afraid. Afraid you were drifting too far from the family, from the values we understood." I didn't argue, I just said, and yet I'm the one working to reconnect now. Not because I need to be accepted, but because I've made peace with who I am. My voice didn't rise. I wasn't angry. I was stating a fact. The rest of dinner passed with a fragile kind of civility. They didn't ask invasive questions. I didn't offer a detailed timeline of my journey. We spoke like distant acquaintances, cautiously warming to the idea of becoming something more. After they left, I stayed behind and sat alone with my tea. I didn't feel victorious. I felt released. There was no apology that would rewind the years of dismissal. But at least now, the silence had been broken. Back at Innerbridge, we were preparing for our biggest launch yet, a full partnership with a national telehealth provider that would integrate our platform across multiple sectors. Harper was in New York, finalizing terms. I handled the West Coast leg, securing compliance reviews and planning rollout strategy. The focus helped. It always did. Work had become more than a career. It was a structure I could trust, a place where value was measured not by legacy, but by the real lives it touched. And yet, the calls from my family continued, slowly at first, then more frequently. My mother sent links to articles about female entrepreneurs and included messages like, "Thought of you." My father asked if I'd consider speaking at an alumni event for his military association, claiming they were interested in stories of discipline applied outside the battlefield. I wasn't sure if that was true, but I also didn't need it to be. I wasn't seeking redemption from them anymore. I had built something steady inside myself, something they couldn't name, but could finally sense. The house had already been constructed. They were simply asking if they could step inside. The shift with my parents didn't happen all at once. It came in small, almost imperceptible moments. A voicemail from my father asking if I could explain how AI-powered therapist routing actually worked. A text from my mother telling me she'd spoken about Interbridge to her book club, calling it impressive, though she misspelled the name. It was clumsy, sometimes awkward, but I recognized the effort. For the first time, they weren't just performing parental pride for others. They were trying to understand something they had once dismissed, and even if it wasn't perfect, I saw that it came from a place of recalibration, not performance. Still, I kept my boundaries. I didn't invite them into strategy meetings or investor calls. I didn't send them quarterly updates. I wasn't ready to merge the world I'd built with the one they were just beginning to acknowledge. That boundary gave me peace. I could engage without needing to be validated. I could share without being dependent on their reaction. It felt clean, measured, safe. Meanwhile, things with Juliet took a surprising turn after the dinner. I assumed we'd return to professional distance. I expected Horizon to proceed with caution now that the founder was tangled in a family narrative. But the opposite happened. Juliet reached out a week later with a detailed offer, one that valued our company at $125 million and included full integration support, brand autonomy, and 3-year leadership continuity for Harper and me. It was generous, thoughtful, and clearly written by someone who understood what we'd built wasn't just code, it was culture. Harper and I spent hours reviewing it. We weighed every term, every clause, every transition timeline. At one point, I asked Harper if she was ready for this. She looked at me, unblinking. We built a bridge so people could reach help. Now we need a bigger bridge. This deal gives us that. She was right. The infrastructure we needed to scale responsibly required more than passion. It required reach. And Horizon could give us that, without hollowing out our purpose. So we signed. The press release went out the next month. The headline was simple: Horizon acquires Interbridge in landmark mental health tech deal. My name was there, first and last, with a photo. No silhouettes, no ghost profiles, just me, standing in front of our Portland office, wearing a navy blazer and a look of calm I hadn't faked for the camera. When the article hit, I expected some kind of internal shift, a rush, of fear, a feeling of being exposed, but it never came. I was ready. I wasn't the girl trying to prove she mattered anymore. I was the woman who knew her work spoke loud enough without screaming. The day after the announcement, my brother called me. It was the first time he reached out on his own since the dinner. No group thread, no passive mention, just his name on my screen. When I picked up, he didn't waste time. I read the article. He said, "I know you probably don't want to hear anything from me right now, but I just needed to say something. I waited. I was wrong. For a long time, I thought I had everything figured out. I thought you needed help. Turns out, I just didn't know what strength looked like when it didn't wear a lab coat. His voice cracked slightly at the end. I didn't interrupt. I let him keep going. Juliet talks about you like you're some kind of legend in the space. But what matters to me is that you kept building, even when we didn't believe. I'm sorry for that. Truly. I thanked him. Not with a dramatic reconciliation or some scripted line. Just a simple, honest thank you. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. That weekend, I invited him and Juliet to my home in Portland. Nothing grand, just dinner. He brought wine. She brought flowers. We cooked together. Awkward at first, but the rhythm came eventually. The conversation didn't hover around business. It wandered books, music, memories from summers at the lake. We laughed at a burnt garlic bread incident and debated whether Aaron had ever successfully parallel parked. It felt human, familiar in a way I hadn't let myself hope for. That night, as they left, Juliet pulled me aside. You've done more than build a company. Sienna, she said, you've changed the way I think about what resilience looks like. I smiled, tired but grounded. Resilience isn't what I thought it was. I replied, it's not just enduring, it's creating something that outlives the moment that hurt you. The next few months moved quickly. As they always do after something big finally settles, the Horizon integration process began in earnest, and with it came new teams, new language, and a different kind of pressure. But unlike the early days of Interbridge, this wasn't survival mode. We had structure now, and resources. I could delegate, trust, breathe. For the first time since we launched, I wasn't operating from scarcity. That shift in pace gave me space to look inward, to ask questions I'd long avoided, not about the business, but about my own capacity for restoration. What did it mean to succeed without needing to be seen anymore? What did forgiveness look like without surrendering your boundaries? Dr. Lang once told me that healing rarely comes as a full circle moment. More often, it arrives in sideways glances, subtle shifts, quiet pauses where anger used to live. I felt that truth when I found myself answering my mother's texts without resentment, or when I said yes to attending Aaron's pre-wedding family gathering without the usual tightness in my chest. These weren't reconciliations, not entirely, but they were signs of movement, of space being made, slowly and cautiously, where once there had only been silence. The gathering was held at my parents' house in Tacoma. I hadn't been back in over 2 years. Everything looked the same. The perfectly manicured hedges, the porch swing no one used, the living room that still smelled like pine cleaner and control. When I walked through the front door, my father greeted me with a long look, followed by a nod that was almost warm. My mother hugged me too tightly, as if she were trying to close a gap that could not be measured by proximity alone. I didn't resist it, but I didn't pretend it erased the past either. Aaron and Juliet arrived a few minutes later, holding hands and laughing about something I couldn't hear. They seemed happy, real happy, not curated for an audience. That mattered to me more than I expected. Juliet kissed me on the cheek and whispered, "Thanks for coming, really." I nodded and told her I meant it. I did. Dinner was what it always was, structured, choreographed, interlaced with passive questions and too many references to who was doing what, in which impressive field. But this time, there was a slight difference. When my aunt asked if I was still working in that therapy app thing, my father interrupted gently. "It's called Interbridge," he said, almost too casually. "It's now part of Horizon's national system. Sienna co-founded it. It wasn't dramatic, but it was unexpected. He didn't say it for applause or to show off. He said it because he now understood it mattered, and perhaps, in his own quiet way, he wanted others to see what he finally had. After dinner, as people drifted into the living room, my mother pulled me aside. Her voice was low, like she didn't want to be overheard. "I've been reading about mental health lately. I didn't realize how little I knew. I always thought strength meant ignoring pain. I'm starting to think I was wrong." That sentence, so small and unpolished, caught me off guard more than any grand gesture could have. It wasn't an apology, but it was an admission, and I knew how rare those were in our house. That night, I didn't stay late. I said my goodbyes, accepted a few compliments, brushed off the more awkward comments, and left without a scene. On the drive back to the hotel, I played the same 3 songs I used to loop during college road trips, music that once kept me company when I felt alone in building something no one believed in. This time, they felt different, not nostalgic, just calm. Back in Portland, Harper and I began planning our next phase. Not just expansion, but purpose. Now that Interbridge was part of something larger, we wanted to ensure it kept its core. We launched new access programs for veterans, developed culturally specific therapy modules, and started recruiting more therapists of color. This was the work that mattered, not the headlines, not the valuations, but the moments when a teenager in Montana or a mother in Detroit finally got the help they'd been searching for, without judgment or delay. Every few weeks, I would get a card or a forwarded article from my parents. My father once sent me an op-ed on trauma recovery from a medical journal. It had a sticky note on it that simply read, "You were ahead of your time." I smiled when I read it, not because I needed the compliment, but because I knew how hard that sentence must have been for him to write. One evening, I walked past a college campus and saw a poster taped to a lamppost. It read, "You're not broken. You're healing. Let us help." In the corner was the Interbridge logo. I stood there for a moment, watching students pass it without noticing. That was the point. We had become part of the background, like infrastructure, quiet, reliable, necessary. We didn't need recognition. We were there when it mattered. 6 months after the acquisition, I began hosting monthly mentoring circles for early-stage female founders in healthcare tech. Not because I had all the answers, but because I remembered how isolating it felt to build something no one around you understood. We met in a small co-working space above a bookstore in downtown Portland. Nothing fancy, just a place with good light, honest questions, and room to exhale. Some of the women came with notebooks full of business models, others just with stories about being talked over in meetings or discouraged from asking for funding. What mattered wasn't the polish. It was the fire in their questions and the steadiness in their eyes when they said they wanted to build something that lasted. I told them the truth, that building something meaningful is slow and often quiet, that people you love might not cheer for you until the world does, and even then, they may still mispronounce what you've built, that you will doubt yourself at 3 a.m. more than once, that sometimes the people closest to you will hurt you without even realizing it. And the choice to forgive them will never be about making them feel better. It will be about freeing yourself from their old version of you. They listened carefully, not because I was some authority figure, but because I spoke like someone who had bled through the silence and still came out whole. One of the younger women, Samira, asked a question that took me back to my early days. "How do you know when you've made it?" she said, half smiling, half serious. The room fell still. I thought about the press releases, the acquisition number, the speaking invitations, the congratulatory emails from people who once ignored mine. None of it felt like the moment she was asking about, so I answered slowly. I knew I'd made it when I no longer needed anyone else to say I had. She nodded, and something in her posture changed, like maybe she didn't need permission either. That night, walking home under the soft buzz of Portland's old street lamps, I thought about the earlier version of myself who used to equate success with loudness. I used to believe that if people clapped loud enough, it meant I'd finally earned my place. But what I'd learned quietly, over time, was that success wasn't about applause. It was about alignment, being able to look at your work and your life and know, without external approval, that it matters, that it's rooted in values that don't shift depending on who's in the room. One weekend, while reorganizing boxes I hadn't touched in years, I found an old notebook from my first semester at Stanford. Inside were half-formed ideas for apps that connected students to peer counselors and community spaces for journaling prompts. The designs were crude, the writing was messy, but the intention was already there, a desire to help people name what hurt, to make pain less private. I smiled, thinking how much had changed and how much hadn't. That was the real arc, not a plot twist, not a public reveal, but a slow return to the original why. Juliet invited me to be a guest speaker at a Horizon Women's Leadership Summit later that spring. The event was held in a glass atrium with city views, perfect catering, and rows of chairs filled with high-level professionals. I stood at the podium, looked at the sea of women who were all balancing something unseen, and spoke not about metrics or market share, but about the cost of building in silence. I told them how for years I edited myself down to make others comfortable, how I shrank my vision so it wouldn't eclipse my brother's, how I wore humility like armor, not because it was virtuous, but because it was safer than being resented. Afterward, one woman came up to me and said, "You gave words to something I didn't even realize I'd been carrying." I thanked her, not because I needed praise, but because I understood the weight of unnamed experience finally being seen. That's what healing looks like. Not victory laps, not big speeches, but quiet recognitions in unexpected places. At home, I kept my life simple. I still lived in the same apartment, still brewed the same kind of coffee every morning, still took walks without music, letting the wind write its own rhythm. I wasn't trying to be untouchable. I was just trying to stay real. The farther I got from the version of me who needed external permission, the closer I felt to myself. And that, I realized, was what no investment, no article, no family praise could ever deliver. A few days before Aaron and Juliet's wedding, my father called for the first time in months without using email or deferring the message through my mother. His voice was steady, careful, as if he had practiced the phrasing. He asked if I would be willing to have lunch with him alone before the ceremony, just the two of us. He said it wasn't about business. I agreed, more curious than cautious. We met at a quiet bistro near their neighborhood in Tacoma. He was already seated when I arrived, staring at a small notepad on the table as if it contained something he wasn't sure how to explain. When I sat down, he looked at me directly, not like a father issuing instructions, but like a man trying to unlearn something. He said he had been reading about mental health in veterans, particularly the connection between silent trauma and delayed collapse. He said it reminded him of soldiers he had trained, men who looked composed until they didn't. Then he paused and said something I never thought I'd hear from him. That for a long time, he assumed my work was a form of avoidance, a way to drift around the real world. But now he understood it was the opposite. that helping people face what hurt them without shame, without command, was a kind of strength he had never been taught to recognize. He didn't call it an apology, and I didn't ask for one. But I left that lunch carrying something lighter. The wedding weekend was a mix of polished joy and carefully arranged vulnerability. Everyone smiled on cue. Speeches were timed to the second, and the venue looked like a magazine spread. I arrived early enough to avoid questions and late enough to miss being pulled into logistics. Juliet greeted me with the ease of someone who knew what it took to earn a place at too many tables that never wanted to set a chair. She didn't speak in exaggerated warmth or give long stares of approval. She simply asked if I needed anything, then moved on like a quiet current in control of the room. That small gesture told me everything I needed to know about the kind of marriage she... During the rehearsal dinner, my mother gave a short speech, not dramatic, not sentimental, just sincere. She spoke about how families evolve, how definitions of success change over time, and how loving someone sometimes means learning how to let go of what you expected them to become. She didn't mention me by name, but I saw the shift. She was no longer trying to control the narrative. She was learning how to let it breathe. Throughout the weekend, extended relatives floated between polite curiosity and awkward compliments. Some still couldn't quite remember the name of my company. Others tried to frame their surprise as admiration, as if being wrong about me gave them a reason to now be especially proud. I no longer took offense. I understood that most people don't actually see you. They just react to headlines and repeat what sounds impressive. And when those headlines fade, only a few will still know your name for the right reasons. Aaron found me alone on the balcony after the reception, where the music inside was still going strong. He leaned against the railing and stayed silent for a minute before speaking. He said the thing that haunted him wasn't that they didn't see me sooner. It was that he never thought to ask, that maybe part of him liked being the one they measured things against, and that if he had known the pressure I was carrying while building what I built, he would have done things differently. I believed him, not because I wanted to, but because he didn't say it to make himself feel better. He said it like someone who finally understood what presence without ego looked like. Back in Portland, the rhythm of my life stayed simple. Mornings with black coffee, long walks before meetings, messages from Harper updating me on the next expansion phase. Interbridge was entering its most stable stage yet, not because we had more users or more funding, but because we finally knew who we were without needing to defend it. Our product had matured, but more than that, so had our belief in why we started in the first place, not to win headlines, not to be acquired, but to give people space to tell the truth about where they hurt and where they hoped. Some evenings, I would stand by my window and watch the city settle, lights blinking into stillness like it had somewhere safe to rest. And I'd think about how long I tried to earn rest by achieving more, by proving harder, by shrinking less. But rest doesn't come as a reward. It comes when you stop needing to fight your own worth. And that's what I had finally learned to do. A few months after the wedding, Interbridge was invited to speak at a National Health Innovation Summit in Chicago. We weren't headlining. We weren't on the banners, just a quiet breakout panel about digital mental health for underserved communities. I wasn't planning to attend, but our lead developer insisted. She said I needed to see how people outside our circle talked about what we were building. I went, mostly to support the team, but partly out of curiosity. The panel was scheduled for mid-afternoon. The room was modest, the lighting soft, and the audience surprisingly engaged. They didn't ask about revenue projections or exit strategies. They asked about real-world impact. They asked how we earned trust in communities that had been ignored. They asked how we designed for dignity, not dependency, after the session. A woman from a rural education nonprofit approached me quietly and said, "I knew someone had to be behind this. I just didn't think she'd look like you." That night, I walked back to my hotel alone. The city was glowing in late spring warmth. I passed a sidewalk musician playing something slow and imperfect on a wooden violin. No one stopped to listen, but he didn't seem to care. He just played, not for approval, not for applause, just because the sound existed and he knew how to shape it. That stayed with me. I realized I no longer needed loud validation to feel present. My story didn't require a dramatic ending or a neatly labeled victory. It just needed to be true. Back home, I visited my childhood room for the first time in years. My parents had kept it almost untouched, like a frozen version of someone they were still trying to understand. The walls were still pale blue. My books were still stacked in uneven rows, and taped to the back of the closet door was the original sketch of what became Inner Bridge. Drawn on the back of a school newsletter with dull pencil and smeared ink, I stood there for a long time, not crying, not overwhelmed, just still. That was the moment I understood why it had all mattered, not because of what I proved to them, but because I stayed loyal to the version of myself no one had defended but me. The next morning, my father drove me to the train station. He didn't say much, just asked if the company was still helping people sleep. I said yes. He nodded once and said, "Good." We sat in silence the rest of the way, but when I stepped out, he lowered the window and said, "I know it's late, but I'm proud of you, Sienna." And this time, he didn't sound like someone reading a line. He sounded like a man who meant it. Now, years later, I don't speak on many panels. I don't lead every meeting. I spend more time listening than pitching. Inner Bridge grew quietly, steadily, the way wild things do when left uncut. We serve more people now than I ever thought possible. But the most meaningful metrics are still the quiet ones. The anonymous message that says, "I didn't know someone else felt this way." The parent who tells us, "Your app helped my kid talk to me again." The late-night call from a former intern now leading her own team, asking, "How did you stay grounded when no one believed?" I tell them the truth. I didn't always. Some days I wanted to disappear. Some nights I rewrote my exit letter. Some mornings I faked certainty because the world punished doubt. But I kept going because something in me knew that quiet work is still sacred, even when it's not seen. So if you're listening now and you've been underestimated, overlooked, or told your ideas were too soft, too slow, too unmarketable, I hope this story reaches you in the place where you're still holding on. I hope you remember that worth isn't decided by applause, that sometimes your fiercest comeback won't look like revenge. It will look like peace. And maybe, just maybe, the person you become on the other side of the silence is the one who was always meant to lead. You just had to get quiet enough to hear her. What if the comeback you've been waiting for isn't about proving anything at all, but finally becoming everything they couldn't imagine?